Hi everybody, this is Ted. Welcome to our video discussion for week 10. So last week we started kind of delving into some more concrete examples of inequality in education um, through sociological lens, kind of specifically talking about class. We talked about the idea or the concept of concerted cultivation, which basically describes the ways in which families activate Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital to try to navigate educational institutions and secure good outcomes for their kids. Similarly, we had the concept of the hidden curriculum, which basically argues that schools are not neutral, but instead they're training children for their probable class position through sort of unwritten rules and expectations. And then finally, we had Bowles and Gintis's correspondence principle, which basically is sort of a grand theory which describes the way, or basically asserts that the structure of schooling mirrors sort of social relations that we might expect in the workplace, which reproduces inequality. And that's basically you know, the boss worker or employee kind of structure where you've got sort of somebody on top who's giving orders and somebody who receives them and just sort of follows them without questioning them. So last week we kind of talked and thought about how the educational system functions as a sorting machine, quote unquote, for social class. This week, um, I think we're going to see, or we're going to kind of throw a bit of a curveball into that and see a maybe this analysis, while it's pretty powerful, it's incomplete because often it's treating class as a race neutral category. And so today we're asking what happens when we center race in an analysis of education. How does the sorting machine operate along racial lines, and what happens when we try to dismantle that function? And we're doing that basically looking at some primary piece of legislation, Brown v. Board, which you all may are probably familiar with, as well as some other kind of literature around the topic. And so we're going to start off kind of talking about one potential framework that we can use to analyze this legislation and its impacts, and that is perhaps you've heard of it, the dreaded CRT. Um, so critical race theory is basically a originated in legal scholarship um, as a way to sort of understand why there was sort of a delay in racial reform in laws, why it seemed like, particularly like black individuals were perhaps being targeted more often by certain laws. Um, but over time, it sort of evolved. And in our first reading that I wanted to talk about, which was the one by Ladson-Billings, basically asking what a CRT and was it doing in education. There are some core tenets that were given, and this is a broad theory, but these are the ones we're going to kind of talk about. The core tenets of CRT is that racism should be taken as sort of a normal kind of component of a social life. It could be considered endemic rather than basically being an aberration, like something that's not natural to a society. Um, Secondly, that CRT functions as a form of storytelling and naming your reality, which is basically establishing a counter narrative as opposed to sort of the dominant narrative that exists in society. And this is a counter narrative that people of color um, push or sort of create to help challenge um, these larger narratives in society to kind of help them make sense of why things don't exactly seem to be as peachy as people might want to think. Third, there's a sort of critique of like moderate liberalism in the sense of I'm not talking like liberal and conservative politically, but like from a philosophy standpoint, which basically one of those components is sort of the belief in sort of slow incremental progress through history. Basically is going to make, things are only getting better, and look at how far we've come. If you've ever sort of experienced that, basically people saying, "Oh, it's way better than it's been before, and we're going to get better just a little bit step by step." The critique here from people who are sort of CRT policy kind of or academics is that a lot of times that thinking can be pretty flawed, because it just assumes that progress only goes in one direction, and oftentimes it's just used to maintain the status quo as opposed to actually make things better. Um, and you might recall sort of in the podcast episode we listened to, there's a little bit of a pushback that the interviewer um, gives to a superintendent, who's because he's basically saying, "Oh, we're going to kind of slowly get better." Um, but that's sort of that idea. So the fourth point, um, that's sort of one of the tenets of CRT, is that change really happens in society when there's a convergence of interests. For example, civil rights reforms in the US really only brought advances for African Americans and Black people when they also served the interests of white folks as well. And an example we might think of that is basically the idea that civil rights, the civil rights movement, and sort of Brown v. Board legislation worked to help improve the US's Cold War image at the time. If you guys are thinking really big picture, um, the idea of sort of communism versus democracy was sort of like a big tension at the time, and it was pretty hard for the US, of course, to say, well, look how we're fighting for everybody's freedom when we also have all this segregation going on. So some people make the argument, of course, that, it was sort of like a PR win that they sort of helped reconcile this because it was kind of like propaganda. Um, Fifth argument that Ladson-Billings makes is that CRT looks at whiteness and property as sort of being intertwined in the US. And that means rights, benefits, and citizenship have often really historically been tied to being white. If you think about in the US, like the first voters, we sort of talked about this, the Jeffersonian conception of democracy. Basically, who was able to vote? It was the white male property owners. Um, and how sort of that was it was a very small kind of closed definition of, you know, I think what we would think of now as democracy, which is everybody means everybody. Um, so we might also be able to think about whiteness, in fact, potentially through Bourdieu's lens of sort of cultural capital, I think, as well. So I think kind of our takeaway from a discussion of CRT and Ladson-Billing's reading is that it's sort of giving us tools to understand Brown v. Board not just as a simple victory, like just an easy win for social justice, but it's letting us think about it a little bit in a deeper way as a slightly more complex event with motivations and consequences that remain deeply embedded in the racial structure of the US. So let's talk real quick about what Brown v. Board actually did. So, a couple points, I think. The court rejected the separate but equal doctrine from earlier sort of legal precedent. I think from Plessy v. Ferguson, if you all call that from your U.S. history days, which basically allowed for segregation. The idea of separate but equal basically said you all can have separate institutions, but they will be equal. Of course, we know in practice that was much more difficult to accomplish. And most African Americans at the time often sort of had to deal with second class second class treatment when it came to government services or even just sort of being in the public sphere at all, with the idea of like separate restrooms and things like that, or different seating arrangements on public transportation. um, the decision, the Brown v. Board decision found, and I think this is a key quote, that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And I think an important piece to note uh, was that this decision was based around the idea of a psychological harm of segregation, which I think there's some social science evidence that basically indicated that black children participating in this system of separation felt kind of inferior in a sense, regardless of the actual equality or not. Um, and I'm sure, we've already sort of established that different schools are functioning in different ways, even now, regardless of actual literal legal segregation. So I think it's um, not hard to imagine. Um, One of the important things to note is that while the court ruled segregation unconstitutional, what it actually meant in practice, what the government needed to do, what the federal government needed to do. And if you all recall, education is usually considered the purview of states, what states needed to do, and, even smaller than states, local school districts needed to do. There was a lot of stuff that still needed to be figured out. And so the actual implementation decree of desegregation, which is called Brown 2, um, it called for desegregation at all deliberate speed, which left a lot of room open for interpretation, and it opened the room. I'm sorry, opened the door for lots of resistance and delay by school districts and states that were not particularly interested in desegregation, but were sort of being forced uh, forced to do so. Um, so I think one of the interesting things for us to consider is found in Minnow's book chapter, which I believe is called "In Brown's Wake," and I think it's interesting to kind of consider both the positives and potentially some of the negative effects of Brown v. Board, and that's the sort of more nuanced, maybe like CRT, edgy kind of version of history that I think is interesting to consider. So I think what were the positive effects of Brown v. Board? I think it was a moral and legal victory. It obviously delegitimized formal state-sponsored segregation and really was a cornerstone of the civil rights movement. It was a massive victory. I think Minnow says that it potentially inspired or awakened other movements that were interested in educational equality, including gender, disability, language equality, and more. And then this is something that the podcast episode brings in. I think the reporter, I think Nicole Hannah Jones, said that there were actually measurable academic gains in the sort of era of peak integration, which I think she said really there was only one generation of that. But basically, that saw the black white achievement gap cut in half. And um, integration didn't necessarily wasn't really working through magic, but it gave black students access to sorts of material resources like quality teachers, advanced courses, and better facilities that they really did not necessarily have access to before and were more often being afforded to white students. Um, so, what was the sort of more negative effects or the peril, I think, of Brown v. Board? Well, um, Minnow and I think the podcast episode as well kind of talk about how this idea of all deliberate speed was sort of ineffective. It was just in fact, some of the stuff did not go far enough. I think that was, that's a lot of what this argument may be. It's basically um, there's lots of resistance to desegregation. White flight is a concept, sort of describing sort of a retreat of wealthy, white, like urban populations into suburbs, and also the creation of private segregation academies. So, private schooling, obviously, the federal government didn't have any control over. So, what happened there was up to whoever was running the school. Um, Additionally, I think there is somewhat of a lesser acknowledged harm to black communities that doesn't go as discussed with the sort of desegregation that Brown v. Board met. And that was the sort of loss of jobs for thousands of black teachers and administrators who were essentially made redundant because integration supposedly meant that they weren't needed um, in these new schools. Oftentimes the schools with the more resources that were being integrated were the white schools. And so uh, oftentimes the black school teachers weren't being carried along. And I think we will actually look at this concept a little bit more later in the class, but I'll give you guys kind of a sneak preview. I think one of the critiques of implementation of Brown v. Board is basically they integrated the schools, they integrated children, but the teachers themselves still remained mm, like majority white, essentially. And that oftentimes, I think, led to uh, difficulties for the incoming African American kids. Second point, and I already sort of mentioned this, was closure of black schools, which oftentimes served as community hubs. Third, was black children bearing psychological, physical burden of integrating into hostile white schools. I mentioned that as well. And then finally, and this is sort of the more CRT point, um, is basically the benefit for the black communities was a secondary to national interest and economic interest. And this is sort of Derek Bell's argument that Ladson-Billings recalls, and I think Derek Bell is the one of the sort of founding figures of critical race theory. Uh, so, in addition to some of the more negative effects, I think, or unfulfilled promises, of Brown v. Board, we often had people begin to sort of conflate the idea of desegregation with integration. And Minnow makes this sort of a crucial distinction that desegregation is a legal and political process of mixing students. Integration is sort of the harder work of actually getting people to acknowledge and recognize and be willing to accept, you know, a difference in the, it's racial difference, but it could be all sorts of different kinds of difference, diversity at large, if you will. Um, and that the challenge of integration is much greater than just sort of a top-down formal. You guys are now in the same room, uh, and then basically, finally, there's this rise of colorblind ideology, which, basically people saying, well, if we have sort of a formal legal desegregation, then there should be no more issues. If there's any sort of inequality still, it's the result of a natural difference or cultural difference that has nothing to do with white families or the government or any other decision, structural decisions. Um, and I think later Supreme Court decisions would often sort of roll back desegregation orders. Um, they would limit sort of potential race conscious policies, and they would often use the idea of Brown v. Board itself. In some ways, it sort of set a precedent to basically say, well, here's formal equality. Now, if anything else is below that, there's nothing the government needs to worry about. And I think we can kind of even see now this discussion of affirmative action between its institution as a race conscious policy and now basically the arguments to end affirmative action. If you all, I don't know how much you guys pay attention to the news, but like basically the arguments now is it's not needed anymore because we've progressed past that time. Maybe it was necessary then, but it's no longer necessary now. So I think we can definitely see, there will be plenty of people saying, I don't see race. Um, and I think oftentimes when they do that, they're just essentially sticking their head in the sand. Uh, so finally, I wanted to end this kind of video talking a little bit about the podcast. I think the podcast gives us a little bit of a idea of history repeating itself to some extent. Um, and the white parental black the backlash and the gym that, people are meeting at this new majority white school worried about integration, or not integration from the Normandy school district, mirrors a lot of the sort of resistance that happened in the 50s and 60s. And the parents claim that this is not a race issue, sort of exemplifies the normality of some of these underlying kind of racist and dominant narratives that CRT is often trying to counter a little bit. And I think that the podcast itself and the stories of the school kids provides a really powerful counter narrative of like what those kids are actually experiencing and how very different those two different schooling environments were. And the conclusion, at the end of the podcast is basically that integration still works, as the reporter, I think Hannah Jones, says, but often nowadays we decide that it's just not worth the trouble. And this is sort of the critique of the idealistic incremental reform narrative that superintendent was pushing. Um, so to wrap up real quick, because I know we've definitely gone a little bit long today, how should we understand the legacy of Brown v. Board? So first of all, I think it was certainly a revolutionary legal decision from a challenge to the status quo. Second, it had real positive effects for Black students during the peak of integration. Third, its implementation was undermined to some extent by sort of interest convergence, um, white backlash, and the sort of perhaps a little bit naive faith in incremental progress. And fourth, the negative consequences for Black communities were real and are often overlooked. Especially that point about teachers, I think, is a big one for us to still to think about. And fifth, ultimately, I think the promise of Brown was limited because the nation addressed desegregation, but didn't really want to necessarily do the hard work of integration and confronting sort of structural advantages that whiteness had and the disadvantages that Black historically marginalized population brought with them. So I think the story of Normandy the school district is sort of the story of Brown's unfulfilled promise to some extent. It shows kind of the sorting machine in action to an extent, versus what does life at the Normandy school district look like versus the, I think, Francis Howell school look like, is very different. Um, and it's working, I think, to separate students and society along racial lines very often. So, thank you all.